Okay, so yes, I think there is nothing left for me to say to introduce myself, because that video that they put a lot of detail, a lot of attention. I thank you very much for having me here. Even though I am on holidays, like Steven said, I think it's very important to share knowledge, and especially when we have new tools or new features in our Angular ecosystem. And this is what I'm going to be talking to you about today. Usually when I speak about Scully connected to performance, I like to compare the metric result or results for static site rendering, which is what Scully does, with those of classic server rendering, right? Or client side rendering. That's what we have for Angular applications as default. I'm going to focus in the client side rendering for now, so we can explore a little bit the metrics we get when it comes to performance. I don't know if every one of you is familiar with this, but if you're doing web development, for sure it's a good thing to be knowledgeable on how performance is perceived by your users. So when we have a client side, I apologize for the noise. When we have a client side rendering strategy, what happens is that the client or the browser is super busy taking care of the business logic, of the routing fetching, of the data fetching from APIs, doing all these logical operations that it needs to finally render a page or a route, right? And because it's so busy with all this, sometimes, and it happens at runtime, by the way, sometimes we get a fast first paint, we get a fast first contentful paint. I really advise you to go and learn what those metrics mean if you are not familiar with them. We also get a fast time to first byte, or the first byte that gets ever painted on the page. But the time to interactive, or the time when the application becomes responsive, responsive in the sense that it responds to user input, sometimes it gets really slow. And for me, as a front-end architect, I am super concerned with performance, obviously, because how well our sites perform is crucial to guarantee return on investment and fulfill our KPIs in the customer side, and also our SLAs on us as providers of web services, right? So this is why I paid a lot of attention recently when Google advertised a new performance metrics, a new initiative they have called Core Web Vitals, consisting on LCP. I will tell you more about it. LCP, FIP, and CLS. And let's see what those acronyms mean. They mean LCP is the largest contentful paint. So it's when the largest piece of content above the fold gets finally rendered, and it's measured in seconds or milliseconds. And then we have the first input delay, which is also measured in time. It's when finally you can interact with the server through this UI. Like you click on a button and then the browser finally gets some response or does something around it, or maybe that happens entirely on the client, right? And finally, the cumulative layout shift. This is super important to us because in dynamic context, and that's mostly our Angular applications, things turn to shift around, and there is a lot of sometimes unnecessary animation, and that plays against our perceived performance or our core web vitals. And that's not measured in time, but in a different kind of unit. But yes, having a static layout served for the first time would help in achieving really well scores for core web vitals. And another typical concern when it comes to delivering sites is SEO, right? And in the case of the typical client-side rendering, like our Angular applications, dynamic content generation happens, and it implies that content is not available to be indexed unless there is a request to a certain route, including the default one. So at least for some browsers, content is sort of obscure. They cannot reach it and they cannot index it, and that plays against our SEO rankings. So this makes client-side rendering sort of problematic strategy for solutions that heavily rely on accurate content indexing, like marketing blogging, for example. And when it comes to Angular, we have a rendering strategy type that sort of overcomes or takes care of a few of the mentioned issues. And what I'm talking about is Angular Universal. So let's explore the performance metrics for perceived speed for the server-side rendering strategy like Angular Universal. It also happens, that happens at runtime, but on the server side. So the whole rendering process takes place on the server, and it now takes care of all those heavy load operations. And the perceived performance metrics are quite similar to the ones of client-side rendering, but we may be facing new problems or additional problems that we will need to solve. So first of all, development for server-side rendering with Angular Universal forces you to consider using dependencies that are ready to execute a lot of operations that we tend to perform on the client now on the server. And also you have to write your code specifically for server-side rendering because, well, for example, the DOM is not available on the server. So you need to write with an entirely different flavor your applications. You also need to use modules that are conceived for this technique, and also maybe need a special infrastructure, more complex, probably more costly as well. And another downside of server-side rendering with Angular Universal, for example, used to be the duplication of state. Because when the application is bootstrapped in the client, since you both request state from the server and the client, it produces a certain flickering because you have a certain state in the client, and then the application gets bootstrapped, and there is like a certain time when things may not match. This issue can be solved with the transfer state API that allows you to precisely serialize and deserialize state in a store from the server side to the client side and avoid this duplication. But all those special requirements, the cost implied, all of that leaves a great portion of dedicated solutions out of the Angular Universal scheme, let's say. It's super simple to have an Angular application up and running, right, with the CLI. Right now, you go and type a few commands and click a button, and you have a working application. But if we wanted to use Angular for a simple blog site, for example, or a documentation site, it is probably not the ideal solution. So needless to say, if you have a standard Angular application and you want to migrate it to Angular Universal because of SEO reasons or because of performance reasons, it is quite the effort. It's not that trivial, and it may take a lot of pain and a lot of headache. So one second. So it's not only performance and SEO that we may be missing out. There is also the whole Jam Stack offering that we may be missing out if we don't have the ability to think about rendering strategies other than server side and client side. And when I say the Jam Stack, what do I exactly mean? The Jam Stack has been around for 5 years, so it's very likely most of you, if not all of you, know about it. But it has gained real traction and has become a real successful methodology, I would say, for about two of those, or for about the latest 2 years. And why is that? It's because it's a collection of best practices that ensure better performance, higher security, and also lower costs at the time of delivering websites. And together with the concept of everything lives in Git, like you don't have to do additional installations of databases or connect to foreign systems in very complex ways. Deploys are atomic inversions. Assets should be served from from a CDN exclusively. Along with all those best practices, we also have the suggestion that the best way to deliver sites is delivering pre-renders, or what we are going to talk about, static generated pages. So like I mentioned, in the Angular ecosystem, we did not have a tool to help us with that. And this is why if other frameworks were really on the train of the Jamstack, Angular was not yet there because it didn't have really the tool to enable this until recently, until December 2019, to be more precise. This is when the hero devs, which are Aaron Frost, Juan Cano, and Sander Elias, they released Scully for the first time. And what is Scully? So, like we mentioned before, it's a static site generation tool. It enables pre-rendering, and it works on top of Puppeteer. And you're going to say, what's Puppeteer? Well, Puppeteer is basically an API to the Chrome Developer Tools protocol that you can use to render HTML on a headless Chromium browser instance. So it's important to keep in mind some of the requirements to use Scully. You cannot just use it for any application at the moment. You need to be on Angular 8 or 9 or above, and you need to also be using Node version 10 minimum. So installation is super simple with schematics. You use ngadd, and the full command is ngadd at Scully.io /forward init, and boom, that's it. You have Scully in your application. And I have to say that I migrated a standard application to Scully. I first had to migrate it or upgrade it to version 9 because it was in version 7, and it was completely painless. So now that you know what it is, what Scully is, and how you install it very easily with schematics, let's see how it exactly works. So the important part is that it does its job at build time. We have seen other strategies, they all work at runtime, but this one is at build time. Instead of on demand or server side or runtime client side, it's while you do the build. So Scully does the whole data fetching, the whole logical operations, all this business logic is interpreted, everything is handled, including the routes at build time, and it outputs or produces this HTML in its static form. So it then places this HTML that has rendered in this Chromium headless browser in a folder that by default is this/static, but you can configure it to be anything else, and we're going to see that later. So of course it needs a router enabled application, because basically what Scully does is it says, okay, we have route 1, 2, and whatever you define, and it maps it or converts it to a normal or standard HTML page. And how does it do that? Well, it has a process. When you run Scully, you trigger a process that runs a bunch of plugins or inbuilt plugins by default. Those plugins take care of different concerns through the process cycle. So you have the router handling plugins that basically take care of handling the route discovery or finding out what routes you have in your application. Then the render plugins that take care of transforming the HTML output. The file handler plugins used by the built-in content folder plugins that take care of different file document extensions, for example, Markdown. And finally, you have the route discovery done and the out done that can trigger scripts or can run processes when the route discovery or everything else is completed. Apart from the built-in plugins, it is very, very easy to write your own custom plugins to solve specific problems in your own implementation. So at the beginning of Scully, you had to write them in JavaScript, but now there is TypeScript support and they are part of the build process, and it's simpler for TypeScript developers. And basically, for any other similar tool that we have in other frameworks, in other communities, the community contributions of custom plugins is very, very important to expand the ecosystem and make the tool even more powerful and cover more use cases. So we are hoping that in time, we're going to have more and more community contributions to the plugins ecosystem, and we're going to have Scully serve even more purposes as it does right now. So I'm going to demonstrate the use of a custom written plugin in a bit. But before we do that, let's talk about another very important feature of Scully, and it is that it allows us to start a server to serve these static files and test the HTML output at development time. So you have the ability of putting together both versions, the fully dynamic Angular distribution and the static pages, to compare them and see how you are doing better at performance and SEO and even inspect your applications and see the conversion. So what is the gain? What is the gain of doing this, of installing Scully? The most important gain is obviously speed. Like we said, it happens at build time. Then you have a fast everything, the fast first pane, the fast first contentful pane, the fast first time to first byte, the fast time to interactive. And when we go back to these core web vitals, all of them are going to be winning scores because nothing will move around. You have now a static page, and the time to interact fully with the content is going to be right away. So performance gets exponentially better when and speed, or like Aaron says, wicked fast pages when it comes to loading them. So let's propose a problem, and let's imagine we want to have a documentation site. So it's just like a blog site. They are the perfect problem to solve with static pre-rendering because it is likely your data is stable. You may not have to connect to any other services for authentication or anything like that. So let me show you how I solved that problem with a little demo. To speed it up, or for the sake of brevity, I have done already some of the work. I have already installed Scully. I have done it to an Angular 9 application with routing, of course. And then I created a module called docs with schematics in the way you are seeing in the slide right now. And in the template for that module, and this is very important, you cannot miss that part if you do this manually, is I added the Scully content tags, and this is where the Scully static content gets injected, right, for each page. And finally, when you install Scully, one of the things that gets created is this configuration at the root of your project. And this is exactly where we can change some of the defaults, like I mentioned before, like the output directory, which is by default this /static, but you can change it to something else if you want. You also have the project name, the project root. And in this case, what I did is I created this entry or this property in the routes property that's called /docs/2 and Slack can match a string that we're going to see, or like we are going to see in a moment. And this I defined that this route needs to be discovered as a content folder type, and the folder where the sources are at is docs. So we're going to also see how I created a site navigation so we could access every one of these documents very easily and very simple. And also it automatically refreshes every time we have new content and we do a new build, because it would be it wouldn't be very nice to be adding all those entries manually. So what I did is I made use of the Scully route service. The Scully route service reads the discovered routes from a JSON output. And then also I used an observable to continuously, like I said, or automate the process of getting new entries into this site navigation. Finally, yes, like to say, I put it in an order list, so I could give it some kind of an order by number. In this case, 1, 2, 3. But you can, in any case, do it in the way that is best to you. So let's change now to see some code and see some terminal work. Let me do this in a moment, because I need to stop sharing my screen and I need to share a different screen. So let's share the entire screen and find the right place. Let me clear this a bit because I was testing. I wanted to make sure that everything worked. And the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to create a new entry. And you're going to see how I do it with schematics, because it would be very painful to do this, or very tedious to do this manually and be creating content in that folder. And by the way, this content is markdown. So Scully is going to convert Markdown to HTML using an inbuilt plugin that it comes powered with. So what we're going to do is we're going to do an ng generate, and we're going to say Scully.io init post. So I could pass right now already the title for my post. And I say post because this is by default meant to create blog posts, and this is why they call it post, but it could be entry as well. But you need to type it in this way because this is what the schematic is expecting. So init post, and let's just do this. And then it's going to prompt me, or it's going to ask me, what title do you want to use for this post? And let's create the home page, because we are going to want to have a default page also in our application. And what's the target folder for this post? By default, like I explained, it's thinking it's going to be blog, but we can pass whatever else we want. In this case, we're going to say docs, and boom, it creates already the markdown file in the docs folder at the root of our application. So now if we go to the editor, we see that we have a recently created docs folder with a homepage empty. And if we take a look, we have a front matter YAML configuration here that we can use to manipulate this file. So I'm going to say, okay, instead of homepage, because homepage is a little bit not too attractive or enticing, let's call it awesome docs site homepage. And yeah, it says as description blog description, but we're going to say, yeah, this is the homepage for my Scully site. And as you can see, the initial state for published for any new page you generate via the schematic is false. It doesn't mean that Scully won't discover it. It means that it will take it as unpublished. So we're going to just set this to true. And also I'm going to add another property called flag. And I'm going to manipulate the path to this file so I can add it to a URL I want. Because right now the URL would be homepage, but I want it to be something else. Let's call it Scully Docs homepage. And I choose this on purpose because I set this one to be the default route for our application. So now we have all these written. We may want to also change this. This is an awesome title. And AI Angular has static content generation now. Okay, now we have all this markdown written and the YAML configuration here. We are going to go back to the terminal and we're going to run Scully for the first time, and we're going to cross our fingers that it goes fine. So we're going to do an npm run Scully and see what happens. So it tells me, the first thing it does is it tells me that to discover new routes, I should be using this flag, dash 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 scan routes. But this is our first content page, so we don't need to do this. But in the future we will. You will see now. And it also tells me that it created the Scully routes that JSON, the one this service we mentioned before, is going to be reading from to create the site navigation. And it also explains me that it created this Scully docs homepage index.html and rendered it into file static slash index HTML, because I told it that this should be the default page for our application. And what we want to do also is we want to launch the server. So let's do an npm run Scully serve, and this will start two servers: the Angular distribution server on localhost port 1864 and the static server on localhost port 1668. So we're going to go here. We're going to reload this. And as you can see, we have the our doc site. I had already some CSS as well to make it a little bit nicer. And we have here the site navigation with the awesome doc site homepage. Yay, Angular has static content generation now. And if we want to see this here, if we go to the distribution, static docs, we have it here. Scully docs homepage is an index.html. We will find the yay, Angular has static content. All this has been output as HTML with all the assets in line because it's a static page. Scully also generated a 404 page for us. And let me show you as well the assets Scully routes over here. This entry with the route path we provided, also the title, the description, the state for published, and the Scully docs homepage. Also, as you can see, because this is using the content folder plugin, it says the source file, which is homepage MD. And also we have the default route, the homepage over here. So yes, we have now a route, but having only one route is not nearly as amazing. So what we are going to do is, I have a little backup here, so I don't have to create one by one, with a few lessons. And let's move these lessons. Let's not move it. Let's copy them to the docs folder. Okay. Let me clear this a bit so you can see. And now, yes, we're going to run Scully with the scan routes. Oops. Scan routes flag. And let's see what happens and what we get. We should be, or Scully should be discovering these new routes. And it does, in fact. As you can see here, that's lesson 2, lesson 1, lesson 3, rendered into file. And it tells you exactly where it's rendering the new files. And if we, launch the server again, go back here and refresh, and we have already all the new lessons ordered over here, and we can go and see them. And as you can see, if I go to lesson 3, I have a gist here because who would want to have a documentation site for developers and not have a GIST or have some sort of code demonstration or example over there? But what happens is that if you, like me, add just a script, like we can see here in the test GIST, it's going to be in the middle of a template. And that's not possible. We cannot execute scripts like this in a template in Angular for security reasons. So what we're going to do is we're going to use a custom plugin written by Sam Flubax. And I said yesterday, because I had a conference where I spoke about this topic as well, that I was going to post in Twitter a series of links. So please stay tuned, because I'm going to do it right after this session, where I'm going to link you to Sam's blog and also to my repository, so you can fork it and continue to play with this and maybe even improve it. So what we're going to do is we're going to go to the configuration. Don't pay attention to this for a minute that is commented, because I didn't want to type all that later. I'm not sure I'm going to be able, because of time, to do this, but maybe we get to see a different kind of data fetching for Scully. So for now, concentrate on this route. And what I'm going to do is I already installed the plugin, again, for the sake of brevity and time. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a constant, and I'm going to call it disable Angular. And this object is going to require this Scully plugin disable Angular that I have already installed and saved as a developer dependency. And then I'm also going to create another constant. This is going to be an array called post renderers. And I'm going to pass disable Angular here. And I could potentially use this. I could disable Angular for all the routes in my static or pre-rendered application. But let me show you. If I wanted to do it like this, I should call the default post renderers property and give it this value. But I'm going to do this only for the routes that are matching this pattern, docs/slug. And to do that, I just create a new property here called post renderers, and I pass it this array. This array could contain potentially as many plugins as you want to execute post rendering. But right now we're only going to use this one, the one we have installed. And now what we're going to do is we're going to rebuild our application. We need to pass it for this plugin to work correctly. We need to I never remember this stats JSON. We need to read the stats JSON in order to know what dependencies from the graph we need to disable Angular entirely. So this is why we need to pass this flag when we are building the application. So now hopefully, I said post. Yes, I am mixing things. ng build prod, we're going to build the production version and pass the flag stats/JSON. Thank you, Angular and CLI, for letting me know that was not an option. And let's hope it hurries, because I have, I think, 5 minutes. Okay, let's clear this. Let's, well, I could do this here, so I don't have to type wrong. And now let's go back to the site. Let's reload, and sometimes it takes a bit anyways, but now you have the gist here in the in your documentation site, and you can put as many as you want, and those scripts are going to be executed because there is no longer Angular to be taking care of that security measure. Of course, use this with care, not maybe for this purpose, but this is an example of a use case on why you may want to disable Angular. You may want to disable Angular because it won't do anything else after the site or the page is rendered, and you don't need to have this dependency being requested when you load the page, because that's going to penalize you also in performance, and you may not need it at all. So it's going to do all its operations at build time, then generate the page, and then maybe you no longer need it and you can disable it. So what I wanted to show you real quickly, I'm not sure I'm going to have time, but let's still try to do this. It's I want to generate another module that we're going to call temporary, and route temporary, and module going to be in the app routing. And once we generate it, we're going to do a couple of changes here, because maybe you say, but what if I want to read anyway all this content from a database or from some endpoint, because it's going to be or it's not going to scale if I am creating markdown files anyway. Or I want users or external users to be able to create this content, and obviously they cannot reach the file system and do it themselves. So what we can do is we can enable this. We can use the JSON plugin to read from an URL endpoint and use a property as the title for each one of our entries. So let's toggle this. Let me disable this for a minute because I don't want it to cause problems. And we also have to go to this new module we created, the temporary one. We need to go to routing, and let's copy this. Let's put title here. So we have a new route discovery pattern. And yes, I have this endpoint in Mocable.io. Not here. Here I cannot log in. Or here, let me see. 1 minute. Let's hope we get to do it. It's gonna be quick. I just want to show you the endpoint. It's asking me to log in, unfortunately. Maybe. Okay, no. Let's forget about that part. But you have to trust me on that. I have an endpoint with a series of entries, and what I want to do is I want to retrieve them. So let's do that. So let's run Scully again. Scan routes, and hopefully it will work right away. Yeah, so all these routes are now retrieved from this endpoint dynamically, and they are going to be created over here in the temporary folder, which is probably down here. Assets, module, source. Oh, I cannot find it. So maybe temporary. Oh, it didn't create it for some reason. Maybe there is something missing because I'm lack of time. Render it into file this static temporary. Oh, okay. So it's not creating the, sorry, it's not creating the folder because it's not a content folder. It's a dynamic creation. So it's here. Temporary, each one of those posts in that endpoint is new dynamic post 1, 2, 3, blah, blah, blah. And they are here generated. And then if we serve the application now with Scully as well, hopefully we have all those new entries on the well, they are not there. I mean, they are there, but they don't have the right data to read from in order to create this item. So actually what we're getting them. The routes are here, but they don't have a title right now. They don't have a description and published. And if you remember, this site navigation, what is reading is precisely the title in order to create these renders. So this is why they are not rendered right there. You cannot see, but you can see that it does create it in the inspector. We are just missing a little bit of logic to be able to also add this title right here. So yes, this is it. I also, now that we're inspecting, we can see that every one of those router links are now a regular href property value or attribute value. So thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed it. Like I say, or I said, we'll post on Twitter, I'll post on Twitter more information so you can fork this repository. You can play around with it. I also created a schematic to do precisely what I said. Make sure that this is rendering over here. And yes, and I hope you adopt Scully, that you have fun with it, and that you can use it to solve some use cases where you need static probably more than something dynamic. Thank you very much.